time today. We're always grateful to be able to connect with you all. My name is Bruce Anthony, and I'm one of the trainers with CERVIS Technologies. Before we get started, I wanted to point out that I have several colleagues on the call today who will be able to answer your questions via the chat function, so please feel free to ask away throughout the webinar. They'll answer your questions directly, and they'll also let me know of any questions that they think would be useful for the entire group. I do also want to note that if they don't have time to answer your question immediately, or if you have to leave before you receive a response, then our customer support team will reach out to you after the webinar. So the plan for today is to give you all the tools you need to master managing groups within CERVIS. We'll talk about how to create groups, either manually or by using the group request form. While we're covering that, we'll also address what features a group contact has access to. And then after that, we'll look at how to use groups for bulk registrations or reservations. And then finally, we'll go over what reporting options are available for groups specifically. First, it's important to start by defining what we call a group in CERVIS. So we define a group as either an external organization or corporation or church or school or some other type of community group or club, or an internal named group of volunteers, such as your list of star volunteers. So obviously, depending on what your end goal is and who you're engaging with will change, some of what you'll utilize from what we talk about today. But we're going to be looking at kind of all of the options available within that. So we're going to start off by looking at creating a new group in CERVIS. So that option is found under the Attribute Management heading under Group Management. So this is obviously from the administrative perspective. If we click on that menu item, this is where you'll go to manage your groups once they're in the system as well. So we'll be talking about some of these functions later. But I want to point out under Standard Options, at the bottom of that list, you have Add New Group. So this is how you would create a new group manually. When you click on that option, it takes you to this page. From here, there's just a few simple items. We have the group name itself, which is pretty straightforward. Below that, we have a primary group contact as well as an alternate group contact. Now, you have to have a primary group contact, but you could have an alternate group contact. And you can list yourself here. That's fine. If you're doing something like an internal list of volunteers, like your board members or something, you might list yourself, and that's totally fine. But if you are working with an external organization, corporation, club, church, something like that, you'd probably want to list that person as the point of contact. Now, that person does have to have an account with you. So if they already have an account, you just search for them by name and click on them to add them in here. If you search for them and they don't have an account, then you'll need to make one for them, which you can actually do from this page. On the right-hand side, there's an icon to add volunteer profiles. So if you click on that option, you can generate an account for a volunteer directly through here. And depending on what level of access your group contact has, they'll have different permissions in terms of engaging with their group. So if you just want to quickly make an account for a volunteer as a point of contact, all you need to do here is enter in their last name, first name, and primary phone number. Those are technically the only required fields when you're creating an account as an administrator, although I recommend treating email address as a required field because that's how someone would be able to log in on their own later. So if you enter those first four fields, you could leave everything else blank. When they log in, they'll be asked to fill out the rest of their account information. But at the bottom, I want to point out the access levels. So again, if you list someone as a volunteer, that's kind of the default. That's what everyone is normally. If someone is a volunteer and they're listed as either the primary or alternate contact for a group, then they're basically just that. They're essentially a point of contact. They do have the ability to register their group members for events, but they don't really have any permissions beyond that in terms of engaging the volunteers' profiles or making changes or running reports. That being said, if you give your group contact group leader permission or group leader access, so that's one of the access levels listed here, and you can of course do this for existing accounts as well, but if this person has group leader access, then not only can they sign up their members for events, but they can also view and edit their volunteers' profiles. So they have quite a bit more permission within that group. They can view and edit those volunteers' accounts. They can register them for events. They can see their registrations and manage those registrations. They can also run reports for their group specifically. They can send emails to the volunteers within their group. They're essentially like a mini administrator for the members of their group. Now, they can't just go and add any volunteer to their group, because that would effectively give them access to every volunteer in the system, but they can create new profiles as a part of their group. So those are your group contacts. Again, both the primary and alternate contacts have the same set of permissions. Now, these are also referenced when you are sending emails. So for example, if you register a group for an event, that contact is going to be the one who receives things like confirmation or reminder emails. If you choose to email groups, you can email the group contacts, different things like that. So that's what these two are used for. The group type below that is either public or private. Public groups would be something that would be accessible to volunteers on the application. Now, this means you have to have groups on your application for this to be relevant. But if you allow volunteers to indicate what groups they're a member of when they're creating their profile, they'll be able to do so for public groups only. So if this is something like a church or a community group or a school that, a lot of people might say that they're a member of or that they attend, then making a public group for that makes a lot of sense. If this is something more like a corporation where there's a set list of people who are employees, or maybe you have a list of like your board members, like I mentioned earlier, you might want to make that private. That means that you can add people to this group on the back end, and there are some ways to do that automatically as well. We'll explore that today with things like reservation codes. But private groups are something that volunteers can't add themselves to, and in fact, they don't even see these on their profile. So volunteers wouldn't be aware that they're a part of a private group. The group status is either active or inactive. Generally, this should just be active. When you make a new group, they're actively working with you, so you'd want to leave it as that. If a group moves away, a corporation dissolves, they end their partnership with you, and you want to mark them as inactive, what that does is it prevents them from popping up in different places where you'd be searching for groups. Now, you can still see the group in the system. You can still manage all of their data and run reports for them, so it doesn't remove anything. It just basically prevents them from being listed as like an active participant when you're running searches for groups. And then finally, you have group notes. These notes are only visible on the back end by default. So they're not necessarily visible to the group contacts, whether they have group leader access or not. Now, there are some cases where that might be true. There's a specific setting that you can enable for group leaders to be able to view this information. But by default, group leaders and volunteers in the group cannot see these notes. They're more for your reference. You can take notes about a particular group, how they did on certain projects, what you like them to do, different things like that. But these notes are also searchable, meaning you can add things like tags to a group, which would then allow you to run a search for a specific set of groups. For an example, if this is a school, I could add something even as simple as like a hashtag. You don't necessarily need to use that kind of language or that type of thing, but I wouldn't generally write something like this in a note, so I know that this is functioning as a tag for me. And if I were to write this in here, I can search for any group that has that tag associated with it, and then as a result, I can run a report for that subset of groups. I can send an email to all the group contacts that are in that subset of groups. Basically, it affords you the ability to add your own sort of categorization to your groups. So obviously, since this is a notes field, you can write in any sort of characters. You can use any type of tagging system that you want to, and you can obviously have as many as you need to. There is a limit for how many characters can be in one specific note, but you can add multiple notes to a group, so you're effectively unlimited here. So this is how you create a group manually. But you also have the option to have volunteers kind of submit that information to you beforehand using what we refer to as a group request form. So I'm going to bring across another screen here. This is the volunteer group request form. You all have access to this. It's enabled in the system configuration, and I'll show where in a minute here. But this form is an open form designed to allow you to capture information from groups. So a group leader would fill this out. They'd give you the name of their group. They'd give you their personal contact information, last name, first name, email, and primary phone number. You'll notice this is actually enough to generate a profile within CERVIS. And then below that, there's a couple fields that you can actually customize. We have two default options in here, desired group participation level, which is like their frequency, and then also the approximate group size, which would of course just be a number. And then there's also a comment section. Now, these two questions above that, you can customize those, and you can also add in two additional questions, and that's done in the system configuration. But again, this form is an open form. It's designed for you to direct groups to it. Like if a corporation wants to work with you, you can send them to this form. They can fill it out. And then once this form has been filled out, it generates a follow-up for you under the volunteer management heading. So under the volunteer management heading, there's a section called View or Manage Volunteer Follow-ups. This can be used to engage with individual volunteers, but this is also where the group request form outputs. So you can see an example here. Lindsay filled that out, and you can see what date she filled it out, which was yesterday. It's assigned to a certain person in my system. We'll go over that in a moment. But you can see on the right-hand side is all of the data from that form. So their participation level, their name, how many people they want to bring, any notes they added. And then there's also an option for me to click here to create a group. And what this does is it pulls the information from this form into that Add New Group menu that we looked at previously, indicating the person who filled out the form as the primary contact. So again, that's the group request form. It's a great way for you to engage. Basically, it's a great way for you to engage groups on their own, kind of have them create their own information or fill that out automatically. So I do want to point out where to enable that form and also to edit the information within that. So under System Management, if you go into Edit System Configuration, at the kind of the middle of the page, you have this Page Content section. And if you open that up and we scroll down, there's an option that says Allow Group Requests to be Submitted Online. This is where you would enable that. This is also where you select who the point of contact is that gets notified whenever one of those is filled out. So that was the person who was notified in the follow-up section. You can also add instructions to that page if you want to here, and then below that is where you customize or edit the questions associated with that form. So you can see there's 2 default fields that we've filled out, but there's 2 additional fields, and you can of course edit the defaults if you want to and add in 2 other questions here. All right, so that is the group request form. And that's how, kind of the 2 main ways that you can have someone create a group with you, either manually or by using that form. Now, I do also want to mention that group request form isn't something that volunteers are going to stumble across. You will need to embed that in your website. We have a video regarding how to integrate service into your website. We'd also be happy to walk through that with you. Just contact your training contact or our customer support team to start that process. Otherwise, you also have the ability to just send out like direct links to that form. All right, so the next thing we're going to look at is what do you do with a group once they've been added into your system? And that depends on, again, what your end goal is. So there's kind of 2 main things that you can do with a group. Let's actually walk through with an example. So we're in my demonstration console. If I go into group management here, let's say that I've been contacted by Ronald Campbell. He's the leader of Boy Scout Troop 103. He wants to bring 30 volunteers to an event. Well, there's 2 ways that I can respond to a request like that. If I do not need to know who those 30 participants are, I just want to know that there will be 30 people present, then I can do a bulk registration. Sometimes we refer to that as a bulk anonymous registration because you don't gather information from the individuals. To do that, you can either do that through the event or you can do that from this menu, the group management page. Next to every group, there is a manage option, which is kind of like the main menu for that group, but there's also a direct icon to go in to register for an event. If I click on this option, it brings up a new dialog in this page. At the top, I can select an upcoming event. I can enter in the number of participants. I could add a registration note as well, and then I can sign this group up in bulk for the event. So again, this type of registration means that I do not know who these 30 participants are. They do not necessarily have accounts with me. And even if they do have individual accounts, they're not getting individual credit. All of the credit is going directly to this group. So we can see there's 30 participants. And then next to that, this is crediting the group with 60 service hours. This event happens to be worth 2 hours per person. So this is one way to gather that information. Again, if you don't need to know the individuals, if you don't need to have them create their own accounts or sign your terms and conditions, then this can be a pretty useful and quick way to assign that type of registration. If, however, I do want to know who those 30 people are, I want to gather their information, have them create their own profiles, then what I would do instead of this, I'm going to remove this, is I would complete a reservation. So reservations are done from the main dashboard. Under the Event or Project Management heading, there is a Reservation Management tool. If we go into this menu, at the top of the page here under Standard Options, kind of like we saw in the Group Management menu, there's a button to add new reservations. So if we click on that, I can add in a reservation code. Now, the idea behind a reservation code is you're creating a way to save spots for volunteers on any number of events. You'll see at this point, I'm not actually associating this with any number of volunteers or any specific event. We're going to create those associations later. At this point, I'm just generating the code that will facilitate that. So I can use whatever information I want to as the code itself. This is what would be entered to access those saved positions. I usually make this something that's pretty legible, something that's easy to understand. So in my case, just Troop 103 works pretty well. The description is just for you. Your volunteers don't see this information. It's really just a reminder who you made the code for. I typically make that the name of the group, but it depends on kind of what your goal is. The reservation contact doesn't really have extra permissions within this. They have the ability to see who has used the code, but they can't, manage those volunteers' profiles or anything necessarily, unless, like we talked about earlier, if someone has group leader access. So I'll go ahead and just put the same person who's my group contact as the reservation contact here. That's also relevant for me, as an identifier. And then importantly, the last item here is a group association. What this does is it identifies that this code is associated with this group, meaning any person who uses this code to complete a registration will automatically be added into this group if they are not already a member of it. And that facilitates some kind of easier reporting, which we're going to look at next. And also, of course, searching for those subsets of volunteers. And then in our case, it also gives this person, Ronald, access to manage their profile because he's a group leader. So if we create this reservation code, it's going to say reservation successfully created. I can click in here to manage it directly if I just want to go straight into it. But I also want to point out from the main reservation dashboard, any code you've created previously will show up here, and you can manage that on the left-hand side. There's an icon to manage the reservation code. When I click on this button, it takes me to a page where I can, again, select an event, enter a number of participants, and then reserve those spots. Now, this is different than doing a bulk registration because the individual volunteers will be filling in these positions. There has to be that much space remaining on the event. So I happen to know that for this event, there's not 30 spots remaining. If I click Assign Event to Reservation, it's going to say, hey, you can't do that. There's only 9 spots remaining. So I could reserve 9 spots, and that would fill in the remaining positions on this event. And now those positions are set aside using this code, so only people who know what this reservation code is, or to whom I have sent a direct link to register using this code, can actually fill in those positions. So again, you could just tell someone, hey, your code is Troop 103. There's a place on the event listing page for volunteers to input that information. But you can also send out a direct link. If we go back to the reservation dashboard, there's a link icon next to every reservation code. There's also a direct email option, which contains that same link. But if we click on this link icon, you can see it pulls up 2 options. They're both the same in terms of functionality. There's just a long form and short form. But if you copy that out, you can send that to somebody. And then when they input that, I'm going to do this in another browser here. You can see it takes them to the event listing page and automatically applies the code. They don't have to enter it themselves. And what that means is that they only see the positions that were saved for them. So this is really useful for like those corporate partners. You just send them a link, and then they would all sign up using that link. They don't even have to think about what they're signing up for because you've set aside the positions that are saved for them specifically. One neat thing you can do with these reservation codes as well is you can actually associate an image with the code. So I mentioned earlier there's a place where volunteers can input the code themselves. That's just directly on the event listing page. Click on Use Reservation Code, and then they can type that in. But again, you can add images with those codes. For example, you can have a corporation's logo so that when somebody goes to that link or inputs that code, they kind of get an identifier and they say, oh yeah, well, I'm in the right place. All right, so again, the point of reservations is that you are allowing the individual volunteers to sign up on their own. They're creating their own accounts. They're just filling in the positions that you saved for them. And then again, it associates them with that group as well. All right, so that leads into our kind of last topic for today, and then we'll move into a time of Q&A. But the last topic is reporting. So what can you do with information that you've gathered from groups? There's a couple of reports that I want to point out specifically. There's a lot of places in Service where you can run reports. We're going to focus today specifically on group reporting. So one thing I want to point out is under the group management heading, there is a report in this menu specifically. It's called the group spreadsheet. This is more of a data export. It includes information from the groups themselves. So you can see that this basically has identifiers for the group, like what group ID, which is a service internal number. There's also the name of the group itself, their type. So all the data that we looked at when we added in the group, including on the right-hand side, any notes you've added will show up in this spreadsheet. So if you want to export group information, this is an easy way you can do that. Now, again, this is just data about the group. If you're looking to pull information like numbers of hours served or different things like that, that's all pretty much going to be done via the report management section from the main dashboard. So under volunteer management is where you'll find report management. And in report management, there are two main reports that I want to point out today. The first that I want to look at is actually report number 4. It's called Group Participation Report. Now this report does use the date range at the top of the page here. That's what this calendar icon indicates. So if we scroll back to the top, let's say I want to run a report for the last 3 months. I could go in and select my kind of date range here. And then I can go down to report number 4. And then there's a couple options here. What this report allows you to do is to search for a particular group if you want to. So I could just search for that group by name, select them, and then run the report. That will only show me activity from the members of that group, as well as any bulk registrations completed with that group. Now, it actually shows me every registration by any of the members. So if there's a member of that group who also participates kind of on their own time, then those hours are also going to show up in there because we're just seeing all of the hours that have taken place based on the individual members of that group, as well as, again, any bulk registrations. So you can run that for one group at a time if you want to. If you leave this field blank, it runs it for all of your groups. This will not give you a sum at the very bottom because a volunteer could be a member of multiple groups, in which case their hours would be recorded in multiple places throughout that report. So it does give you a sum at the bottom of every group. It kind of tells you a summary for each group, but it's not going to give you a summary for the entire report. Now you can also use this report, or run this report rather, using group name keywords. So this is a keyword search based on the name of the group itself. So if you have multiple groups with the same name, maybe there's a corporation with multiple branches that kind of works with you. You could input the name of that group that's shared, and then this report would run for all of the groups that match that. There's a detail level here. You can do a low, medium, or high detail report. That just changes how much information shows up on the report. If we run this in a high detail, for example, this would show us every single registration carried out by any individual who's a member of the group that we ran this for. So that's kind of the highest level of detail. Medium would just pare down from that. It gives us a summary for each person and then a total for the group. And then low detail just gives us a total. So how many hours were served by the group, how many people are a member of that group. It basically just gives you the numbers. There is also a roster view here, and this is just designed to give you the contact information for the members of that group. So if you needed to export that type of data, this is a way you can do that. There's other ways you can export that data as well using like a spreadsheet function in the volunteer management menu. Or if you want to just email, for example, all of the members of a group, the best way to do that is actually just go back into group management. You can select one or more groups, and then you can click on Show Members. That essentially runs a search for all of the members of any of these 3 groups in this case. And then I could just directly email those people from this menu. So if you're looking to operate, or take actions within Service on a group, you just want to run searches internally rather than do an export like that roster view. All right, so that's that 4th report type, the group participation report. Again, where this report shines is if you're looking for all of the registrations from all of the members of a particular group or maybe a couple groups. But generally, this is best run for one group at a time or a set of groups if there's not a lot of overlap there. The other report that I want to talk about is the custom participation report. And the reason I want to talk about this one is because you have the ability to set queries on this report. This report allows you to view just particular subsets of your system in a report. So there's 4 query options here. There's a volunteer search, there's an event search, but then there's also a group search, and then there's also a reservation code search. So, for example, you can actually run any search in the group management menu and then use that as criteria for your report here. So we talked about that concept earlier of adding a note to a group, which would be like a tag or a searchable term. If we go back into group management now, you can see at the top of the page here, you can search for groups by name. So I could just type in like Boy Scout or Troop 103 or whatever and find that troop. But you can also search for groups using note keywords. So again, I mentioned the idea earlier of identifying multiple groups using a tag like school or corporation or church, something like that. And then you could go and search for all of those groups. Once you've run that search, then you can go back into report management and you can say for the query here, use your previous group search. And now this report will only contain hours for individuals who are a member of the groups that showed up in that search. So all of the members of schools, for example. So that can be really useful if you want to view, a particular set of all of your groups in one report. This will allow you to just narrow that down directly. And then you can select how much data to include in the report, information from volunteer profiles. You'd probably want to include what group they're a part of. So group membership is an option here. And you could have like what event information you want to include. And this just depends on what level of detail you run this report. We have a lot more information about this report specifically elsewhere, but if you have any questions, obviously go ahead and ask those. And then the other option, the other query that you can run here is based on reservation codes. So if you are diligent about using reservation codes whenever a particular corporate group engages with you, then one of the benefits of doing that is if we go back into reservation management, you can actually search for that code using either the name or the description of the contact person or even the associated group. Let's say you have multiple codes associated with one group. You could go and search for those reservation codes, whatever method you choose to do that with. And then once you've run that search, again, go back into report management. And then we can select our previous reservation search as our query. And now what this will do is it will only show us registrations that took place using that reservation code. So this is an even more restricted view. I'm not viewing all of the hours that volunteers who are a member of a certain group served. I'm only viewing the hours that were committed or registered by a reservation code. So if you're diligent with a particular organization or corporation, you always use a reservation code whenever they work with you, then this report can be really useful in giving you a really narrow look at all of the times that they served with you, across whatever date range you want to use. If you use the same reservation code over and over again, this can be really beneficial. All right. So those are the reporting options that I wanted to mention today. Again, if you have any questions about those, please feel free to type those in the chat. We do have a lot more resources about reporting in general, a lot of short YouTube tutorials about that, and of course our support team has a lot of information listed out on our support database as well. So that's kind of the end of our content of what I wanted to get through today. So we're going to open it up to questions here. So again, if you have any questions, just continue to type those in the chat, and our support team who's on the call will be able to answer you directly, and then of course they'll pass some to me as well. So a question came in, if you have more than one group leader, so more than one contact on a group, do the two contacts have to have the same level of access? The answer is no. They do not have to have the same level of access, and that will change what they have permission to do. So for example, I have this group here, Central High School, with Janice and Barbara as the points of contact. They do not necessarily have to have the same level of access to service. If Janice has group leader access, then she has those permissions that I talked about previously, where she has the ability to create, volunteer profiles, edit their accounts, run reports, send emails. If Barbara only had volunteer access, then she would only have the ability to, manage registrations for the members of that group. They do not have to have the same level of access, between these two contacts. That's a great question. Another good question came in: how can you access the direct link to the group request form? And there's really kind of two ways to do that, actually. One is through an article that we have on our database called Integrating Service into Your Existing Website. Now you can find any of our support articles in a couple different ways. At the top of the page here, there's a search box. You can search for them through there, but at the bottom, there's also this Need Help button. This is how you contact our support team. This also searches our knowledge base. So if you search for integrating or website, that'll find that document right away. If you click on that, it opens up in here, but I like to pop this out just because this is kind of a larger document. So this document contains details on how to embed service into your website. If you have not done this, or if you have any questions about this, again, please feel free to contact our support. We'd love to help walk you through this. But in this document, towards the bottom, in options 2 and 3 are links to the external console, and this includes links to things like your group request form. So that's where you can find this link. You will always need to change the console ID number or the organization ID number represented by 4 X's in these links to what your organization's ID number is. You can find that number in any existing URL that you have, like to your admin login page. You can see it's listed here, but also in the system configuration. Under organization information, it's the very first item. So that's where you can find that link. Again, I just went to the Need Help tool, searched for integrating or website, and that article will pop up, and then you can find that. It's kind of closer to the bottom, but the group request form, you'll find the 2 direct links for that in options 2 or 3. Yeah, that's a great question. All right, so a question came in about kind of what really a group allows you to do. So we've been talking today a lot about like registrations and reservations, but one of the key factors of a group is that they are an attribute. So groups are an identifier that you can use on volunteer profiles. I kind of hinted at the idea of exporting volunteer information using group searches, things like that. But one of the main benefits of groups is searching for sets of volunteers. A good example is internal lists of volunteers, right? If you have a list of your star volunteers or people who are approved to do a certain type of work or different things like that, groups are a way for you to categorize those sets of individuals. You can run searches for those subsets of volunteers. And then one of the other main things you can do with groups is you can actually set restrictions on events using group participation or group registration as that identifier. So again, if we go back to the idea of using groups to keep track of like internal named groups of volunteers, if you have a set of like your regular volunteers, for example, well, what you can do with that is you can go and run a search for all those people. Then I could go and send them an email or print out some information, like do a spreadsheet if I want to. I can combine that search with other data as well. So from the main dashboard you can get here, but you can also go in from this menu. We're just in the volunteer database. If you go into advanced search, you can search for volunteers using any number of items on their profile, one of those things being group options. So if someone's a member of a particular group. And you can combine that with other searches as well. So you could say, I want to find people who are a member of this group and also maybe said they generally have availability on Fridays. Right? So you can kind of narrow down your results. Again, groups function as an attribute in this regard. So you can run searches for sets of volunteers using what group membership they have on their profile. So that's one kind of main thing that you can do with groups is just running searches, sending out emails, and then again, using that to run reports as well can be a thing. But then one other main thing you can do with groups is, again, you can use them as restrictions on events. So if I create a new event or if I go into an existing event, if we scroll towards the bottom, in the section where you have restrictions, one of the options is to restrict registration based on group membership. So if I want this event to only be allowed for my regular volunteers, I can search for that group. And then by having that selected here, the only people who have permission to register for this group are people who are, register for this event are people who are already a member of this group. So they have to have been added to this group in one form or fashion. And in this group, it happens to be a private group. It means that someone on my team has to have added them, or it has to have been associated with a reservation code that automatically added them, something along those lines. Yeah, that's an excellent question. So another question came in: if the group does not fill up all reservation spots, is there a way to reduce the amount of spots originally saved to allow other registrations or to accommodate more registrations? The answer is yes. There's actually kind of two ways you can do it. One is if you go into Reservation Management, you can click on Manage Reservation Code, and then to the right here, you can see next to all these reserved spots I have, there's arrows to increase or decrease these reservations. So you can do that directly through this menu. So let's say we're close enough to this event that I want to free up the remaining positions here that weren't reserved. I can just use these arrow icons to reduce those. So this one was 4 of 5, now it's 4 of 4, so it's kind of paired up. Same thing down here. If I want to reduce this one, I can bring it down to 3, and this one I can bring this one down to 11. And then that would just immediately free up those other open positions. This does function immediately. Volunteers who are interested in this event would immediately see those positions open, become available, so they could start signing up right away. You can also do this exact same function in the event management side. So if you're looking at an event that has reservations on it, you'll be able to see those reservations and how many positions are available. When you go into view the list of registered volunteers, you'll see the reservation codes here. And again, you can increase or decrease those directly through this menu. So that's another place you can do that. One final thing you can do if there's a reservation that was really large and there's a lot of spots still remaining on that. Obviously, you could just decrease that all the way, but you can actually remove reservations as well. That will not affect anyone who is currently registered. It also doesn't even remove the reservation code association from their registration, so you can still run reports on that. It just would immediately free up all of the remaining positions. All right. So that looks like it's all the questions for now. Again, if you do have any more questions, please feel free to keep submitting those. Our team will remain on the call here for a bit to answer any more questions that do come in. So we'll leave this open for a little bit, and if any others come in, we might touch on those as well. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time today, and please feel free again to keep asking those questions. We'll just leave the call open for a bit here. But thank you for attending, and I hope you have a great rest of your day and a good weekend.